Just like our first supergroup, the Excavata, our second supergroup that we're going to look at under the domain Eukarya is made up of nothing but protists. So this second group is the chromalveolates, and the chromalveolates are also extremely varied group, but they are made up of nothing but protists. They may have originated by secondary endosymbiosis, and the proposed endosymbiont is red algae. They are still a group, again, that is in flux, or a controversial group, and they include two subsections we're going to look at called alveolates and straminophiles. And there are some examples that you might be familiar with in this group. We'll take a look at them. So here we are now into our second supergroup. Again, this is made up of nothing but protists. These are the chromalveolata, or the chromalveolates, and we're going to look at two subsections of those called the alveolates and the straminophiles. And some of the examples that you might be familiar with include the dinoflagellates, some of the ciliates like a paramecium, diatoms, and some of the different kinds of algae like brown algae, which makes up the kelp forests and that type of thing. So we'll take a look at some examples and try to stick to the ones that perhaps we already know. The first clade underneath this supergroup are called alveolates, and they're called alveolates because they have this little membrane-bounded sac called alveoli just under their plasma membrane. We're not really sure what the function of that alveoli is. There it is right there. So this is their flagellum, and they've got these little sacs underneath their plasma membrane. We don't really know what the purpose of that is, but it's a common characteristic amongst all the creatures in this group. And some of the ones you might be familiar with, so we'll look at those like dinoflagellates and ciliates, including the paramecium, which is perhaps a creature you've seen before, either in a picture or under a microscope. Dinoflagellates are cool little protists. They have two flagella, and each cell is reinforced by cellulose plates. They kind of look like a little armored BB put together with two sides with the cilia in the middle, and they are extremely abundant part of marine and freshwater phytoplankton. So you're going to find them in both lakes and streams as well as the oceans, and they are in extremely large numbers in those aquatic environments. Very diverse group of aquatic phototrophs, mixotrophs, heterotrophs. Again, if there is a different way to get their food, there's probably an example within this protist category. One of the important things about these dinoflagellates, there's a good example of them, is that they are responsible for perhaps something you've heard of before called red tides. Sometimes when huge numbers of these dinoflagellates gather, they give off certain chemicals. Some of these chemicals are toxins that can cause problems. So if you've ever gone down to the Gulf of Mexico and you want to go swimming or something like that, sometimes you have to be cautious because, particularly in the warmer waters of the Gulf of Mexico, during certain times of the year there'll be huge numbers of these dinoflagellates in the water, and they're putting out a kind of toxin, and that toxin also has some coloration along with it, so you get this red tide is what they call them, and that toxin can kill off fish. It can be fatal to other types of sea life. It can even make humans sick. So if there is a big dinoflagellate bloom going on and this red tide is coming in, they might warn you against swimming too much because you could ingest a lot of this toxin, and that could even make you sick. So they're cool little creatures. When you see them underneath the microscope, they kind of spin around because their flagella comes from the center portion here, and they basically just kind of spin, kind of like a little rotating BB underneath the microscope. So dinoflagellates are a good example of this particular category, and maybe ones that you've seen or heard of before. I think I do have a video. If you look underneath the notes folder, hopefully I have this video of the dinoflagellate. You can check it out. Another example of this subgroup is a group called the apicomplexans, the apicomplexans or apicomplexans. I'm going to have a hard time with all of these names. There's really only one example there that is important to us, so let's take a look. I mentioned these apicomplexans because most of them are parasites, and some of them cause some pretty important diseases. So the apicomplexans, one of the ones that we want to look at is called Plasmodium. Plasmodium is the parasite that causes malaria. Malaria is a disease that oftentimes gets passed by mosquitoes from one person to another or from one animal to another. The Plasmodium protist requires kind of humans and mosquitoes as hosts to complete its life cycle, and it's an important parasite to know about because the disease it causes, malaria, causes the death of about 900,000 people every year. So it's no small matter, particularly in areas around the equator where mosquito populations are just consistently heavy all year long. You have malarial outbreaks and malarial problems. We kind of talked about in other chapters we talked about sickle cell anemia and how that condition gives you a partial resistance to malaria and why that was important and that type of things. So we have ongoing efforts to try to develop vaccines, and of course we also use things like physical barriers like mosquito netting and that type of thing to try to keep mosquitoes away so they can't possibly pass on this plasmodium, which is another good example of this one particular supergroup under eukarya. So the plasmodium is a protist, a parasite that causes the disease malaria, and they require, like I mentioned, they kind of have to spend time inside the human body where they do part of their reproductive system, and then part of the reproductive system includes being inside the mosquito, so they kind of have to have two hosts to complete their whole reproductive system. The third of these subgroup alveolates that we're going to look at are called the ciliates, and you're probably familiar with the ciliates. The most well-known one is called a paramecium, so let's take a look at that guy. Ciliates, again, are a large varied group of protists. They're named for the cilia, the tiny little hairs that are all along the outer side of their body, and instead of like little whip-like tails of flagella, they have cilia, which are usually numerous little hairs that act like little fingers or oars to kind of move them along, and it also helps to pull food into their body. They're interesting that they have two different nuclei. They usually have a large macronuclei and a smaller micronuclei. And they undergo oftentimes that process that we called conjugation. Remember when we talked about the bacteria that undergo conjugation with that sex pilus where they transfer genetic information? Well, this parameciums also do that same thing, and two individuals will exchange haploid micronuclei. So in this case it's actually an exchange process where the two parameciums will join together and then exchange part of their genetic information. So conjugation is a sexual process, and it's separate from reproduction, which is binary fission. So a paramecium usually reproduces the same way that the bacteria did that we talked about, where they simply grow and reproduce a copy of everything inside and then divide in half. But they do have a way of kind of sharing genetic information through conjugation, somewhat similar to the bacteria we already talked about. Here's what this guy looks like. Paramecium is a ciliate, a very common one here that you've probably seen perhaps in another biology class or on a picture or on the TV or something like that. They have a kind of a mouth called an oral groove. You see all the cilia on the outside of their body. They have a micronucleus and a macronucleus, food vacuoles. They have a contractile vacuole which helps pump water in and out of their bodies. So they're very cool creatures to watch alive underneath the microscope. A good example of this particular supergroup. I think I should have some videos up of paramecium, hopefully, if you look underneath the Chapter 28 folder for the notes. Continuing under this supergroup chromalveolates, we're now going to move on to the secondary subsection called the straminophiles, and the straminophiles have a number of examples that you're probably familiar with, including the diatoms and brown algae, and we'll kind of focus on them. The straminophiles contain some important phototrophs and several clades of heterotrophs. Most of them have two flagellum, a hairy one and a smooth one. So there's a good example. That's one kind of characteristic that kind of puts them all together. Not all of them have that, but many of them have the two flagella there. The straminophiles include things like diatoms and golden algae and brown algae and oomycetes. We'll take a look at a few examples. Diatoms you've probably heard of or seen before. They're unicellular algae with a unique two-part glass-like wall of hydrated silica. They actually take silica from the water around them and they build these like glass shells that are kind of like a jewelry box, or where they have kind of a lid and a bottom portion and they close together, and they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and different colorations, so they're almost like little Christmas ornaments. You can see a big variety down here, and they're made up basically a glass-like material, the outer shell is. They usually reproduce asexually and occasionally sexually. Again, you're going to have a huge variety within the group of protists. Here's a wonderful picture. This is a colorized SEM, so when they take the shot through the microscope, it's in black and white, and then they go in the computer and they add the color. You can see where it has like a top half and a bottom half, and this outer shell is made up of a glass-like silica material. Diatoms are a huge portion, a huge component of phytoplankton. Phytoplankton is all the number of tiny little creatures, microscopic creatures that float around in the oceans. Highly diverse, Fossilized diatom walls compose much of the sediment known as diatomaceous earth. Maybe you've heard the phrase diatomaceous earth. It's a material made up of the ancient remains of billions upon billions of these diatoms that died and left their little shells behind. This diatomaceous earth is actually used in a wide variety of ways. We use it as a filtering medium. We also use it even in things for abrasives, like in waxes and cleaners and even toothpaste. So if you brush your teeth and your toothpaste has a little bit of a gritty feel to it to help clean your teeth, that could be the fossilized remains of the shells of these diatoms that we're talking about. After a diatom population has bloomed, if there is like an explosion of the population, many of the dead individuals die and slowly sink down to the ocean floor. Down there at the ocean floor, there's not a lot of creatures to decompose them. So some of the bacteria and other creatures that might help decompose them, they don't live down at the ocean floor. So these undecomposed creatures fall down, and with them they take all of the carbon that is inside their body. All the carbon dioxide that they pulled in during the photosynthetic process that they might have been doing and storing as part of their body, well, all that carbon then sinks to the bottom of the ocean. So the diatom population kind of acts as a carbon sink or a carbon pump, removing carbon from the atmosphere and sort of storing it at the bottom of the ocean. And that's kind of important. It's a part of the carbon cycle of our planet. And think about like global warming and some other issues that are revolving around the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Well, diatoms are a good example of how nature helps to try to control some of that, and diatoms, as they sink to the bottom, are actually kind of trapping and storing some of that carbon at the bottom of the ocean. So I think I have a video clip of some various diatoms in the folder there. If you'll take a look, hopefully you'll be able to find that. Another good example of this particular group are golden algae. We won't spend a lot of time talking about the golden algae. They're usually photosynthetic. They are photosynthetic. Some of them are mixotrophs, and they're usually unicellular, but sometimes they work in colonies where they kind of work together as a team to get things done. Let's talk about the brown algae. They're perhaps a little bit more important, or not important, but not more important, but perhaps more familiar to us. The brown algae are the largest and most complex of all the algae. They very much look like a plant, even though they're not a plant. They have a lot of the same parts. They look like they have a lot of the same parts. The brown algae are multicellular, and most of them are marine. In other words, they live in the oceans. The brown algae make up a lot of the species that when people say seaweed, they're probably talking about brown algae. And they have, again, the most complex multicellular anatomy of all the algae. They're going to seem very similar to plants. If you look at one, it looks a lot like a plant, but this is not a plant, even though it seems to have a lot of the same parts. This is a protist, a multicellular complex protist called brown algae. They have basically parts that are analogous structures. So convergent evolution has caused plants and these protists to have very similar looking parts, but that would be convergent evolution, causing analogous structures, not homologous structures. So if you look at the entire plant, some of them can be quite large. If you've ever heard of the kelp forests, particularly like I think off the coast of California, there's kelp forests there, and some of these giant seaweeds called kelps can be half a football field in length. So you're talking about a protist that can be half a football field in length. Of course, it's multicellular, so that helps. The body of the algae is very plant-like. Altogether, you would call this a thallus. So this all together is called a thallus, and that thallus has a couple different parts. It has something called a holdfast, which is very much like roots to hold it down, and then it has something like a stem called a stipe, and then it has some blades on top which are very leaf-like. So it looks very much like a plant, but this entire thing we call a thallus, and it has parts like the holdfast and the stipe and the blade. But again, these are analogous parts to a plant. They're not homologous. They're not similar. They didn't come from the same point, evolutionary speaking. Last example of this category, and I only mention this one because if you have an aquarium, you might be familiar with this, oomycetes. Oomycetes include water molds and downy mildew. They once were considered in the fungus category, but now we know that they are protists. They're not fungus, but they seem very they seemed very familiar or very similar to fungus, and that's why they were categorized that way. They are usually decomposers or parasites, and if you have fish or an aquarium, you might have to be concerned with a little disease called ick, I-C-K, or downy mildew. And if your fish get injured, sometimes they can be attacked by this protus. Here's a dead goldfish here who has been covered by this particular protus, this oomycete. And so this is a problem and a disease that crops up in aquariums sometimes that you have to be cautious of or familiar with. So that's chromalveolates. The chromalveolates are divided into these two categories, alveolates and straminopiles, and there's a lot of different ones in here that you're probably familiar with. Again, think about the dinoflagellates, think about the plasmodium that causes malaria, the ciliates such as the paramecium, the glass diatoms, the brown algae that forms the kelps. Those are the ones that I might want you to be most familiar with. So let's go ahead and move on. These first two supergroups contained all protists, and so now we're going to go into a third supergroup, Rhizaria, and you're going to find that it too is all protists. And we'll talk about Rhizaria in just one moment.